Well, thanks everyone for coming today. I'm Jim Goldguy. I'm a research affiliate here in CSEC and at CDDRL. And what a treat it is for me to welcome Dr. Bianca Freeman here to CSEC. We first met a year and a half ago. I was putting together my syllabus for my International Relations PhD seminar at American University. And I was looking for some readings on race and racism in IR, and I found a piece on that subject in the Annual Review of Political Science, and looked up the authors and was so impressed with what I saw about Dr. Freeman, then not yet doctor. She was finishing up her PhD at UC San Diego. And so I asked her if she would agree to talk to my students, with my students, about the piece. Which she graciously agreed to do in exchange for lunch at ISA. And we did it again this year. I'm looking forward to lunch again in Chicago. But I also said, when she got this postdoc, oh my gosh, we have to connect you to CSAC, and hopefully you can come down and give a talk and meet folks here. So I'm thrilled that it worked out, that she was able to make the time. She is currently a 2024 to 2026 UC President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Travers Department of Political Science at UC Berkeley. As I mentioned, she received her PhD from UC San Diego last summer. And her talk today is Entrusting the Lamb to the Wolf, Racism and International Intervention. And again, thrilled to have you here, and welcome.
Thank you, Jim, so much for the kind introduction, and to Harold and all of CSAC for this invitation. It really is a pleasure to be with you all today. So for this talk, I'll be sharing developing work that fits into a larger book project on race and international law. And so I thank you in advance for your feedback and engagement. During a UN General Assembly plenary meeting in 2009, the United States affirmed that mass atrocity crimes were not confined to any particular part of the world. Instead, the most egregious violations of human life occurred in the North and in the South, in poor countries and in affluent ones. A similar admission about the prevalence of atrocity was made by the UN Secretary General in January of that year, as well as by the Assembly en masse at the World Summit 4 years prior. In 2005, UN member states unanimously adopted the responsibility to protect, a collective commitment to mass atrocity prevention. It was developed in the wake of a global failure to stop the worst forms of violence in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia during the 1990s. Against the backdrop of the UN Charter, the R2P framework outlines actions the international community can take to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. While the ambition of R2P was universal across UN member states, the outgoing task of the summit became implementing decisions on R2P in, quote, a fully faithful and consistent manner wherever a failure to protect was probable or evident, end quote. R2P was to be applied without prejudice, a view espoused by the United States and others during the 2005 summit and again in 2009. In the opinion of the United States, the types of horrors that marred the 20th century were ubiquitous and need not be a part of the landscape of world politics. Sri Lanka also cited the UN Secretary General, upholding the view that mass atrocity crimes were perpetuated within developing and developed countries alike. However, unlike the US, Sri Lanka urged the Assembly to resist pointing the finger in one direction. That is, decisions on R2P were perceived to betray a double standard between the North and the South. Sri Lanka's rebuke underscored the, quote, personal prejudices that creep into early warning analysis, conclusions, and recommendations on the question of intervention, end quote. For Sudan, R2P represents a, quote, complex maze of prejudice and double standards that prevent countries, developing countries specifically, from letting their guard down. Entrusting the Security Council to be executor of the concept of sovereignty as responsibility would be tantamount to giving a wolf the responsibility to adopt the lamb. Since the World Summit, nearly 2 decades of UN meeting records reveal similar concerns about the selective application of R2P. Some member states believe that the criteria for preventive or reactive intervention is more rigorously applied to countries outside of the West. Moreover, who gets to define a candidate situation for R2P is a key debate that animates beliefs about a double standard between the North and the South. For some member states, the notion of conditional sovereignty sustains racial bias against non-European countries specified at risk of a failure to protect. The concept of R2P reformulates sovereignty as responsibility, a pretext for intervention that several members associate with the capitulation of non-white peoples and governments. During an assembly meeting, Venezuela stated that R2P fosters a double standard, quote, characteristic of the racist, supremacist empires and their allies who insist on sustaining their domination with wars of neo-colonization against countries that have decided to be free, end quote. According to Qatar, R2P beckons the area of colonialism and racial segregation justified by the West as enterprises seeking the welfare of the uncivilized, barbaric nations. Other member states emphasize a lack of accountability for Western states that exhibit racialized atrocities of their own. In response to condemnation of its human rights violations, China attempts to shift the attention to America's original sin. It calls for the US to, quote, face up to its genocide of Native Americans, its systematic racial discrimination against ethnic minorities, and its unilateral coercive measures against developing countries. Some European members also warn against the racialization of R2P. Ireland urges the Assembly to stand firm against the selective application of R2P on the one hand and passivity on the other. Either bias producing consequences particularly disastrous for minority populations. Despite strong speculation about a global color line, R2P is also applied differentially in the South. During another 2009 meeting, South Africa reminded the Assembly that its, quote, dehumanizing system of apartheid was declared a crime against humanity, one of the 4 crimes identified in R2P by the General Assembly. And yet the question of South Africa attracted 3 simultaneous vetoes every time it was put to the vote in the Security Council. Pakistan criticized the silence of the concept sponsors on the need for collective action to protect the people of occupied Palestine or Jammu and Kashmir. According to Qatar, recent events in Gaza and before that in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan highlight the international community's reluctance to implement the R2P principle fairly, justly, and without politicization. Palestine argued that R2P is applied selectively, focusing on some situations while ignoring others, despite global recognition that all populations are entitled to such protection. Sudan frames this discussion by recalling a similar failure to save lives in Rwanda during the 1994 genocide. R2P has been invoked in over 100 resolutions across UN principal organs since its formal endorsement by the General Assembly in 2005. Although R2P was designed to protect populations around the world from mass atrocity, it is selectively applied to societies outside of the North. However, cases of inaction are also observed over atrocities that would otherwise qualify for intervention by UN standards. So I ask, why does the international community intervene in some cases and not others? I argue that R2P betrays a racialized bias, whereby the legal principle of sovereignty is transformed into a conditional privilege withheld from most non-European countries, all else equal. International law establishes the principle of sovereign equality between states, yet the principle itself can overlap and reinforce other widely held norms that feature beliefs about the right to self-govern. Debates over a people's capacity for self-rule, often driven by strategic incentives to intervene, are historically framed or even justified by racism. Since R2P restores a similar debate, wherein state sovereignty becomes contingent, it can affirm prevailing beliefs about race and capacity for self-governance as a means to political ends. I use this theory to make propositions about R2P as an outcome of a racial double standard contested by UN member states over time. First, the international community is more likely to associate a failure to protect with non-European states and therefore invoke R2P. Conversely, the UN is more likely to spare European states from corrective action, even when the commission of atrocity and symptoms of incapacity are just as severe. To address empirical differences between cases, I examine R2P cross-nationally by matching on characteristics that likely drive intervention. Using UN resolutions and original data on mass atrocity events from 2004 to 2022, I measure the relationship between receiving or target country racial majority and the decision to intervene. The results suggest that R2P is disproportionately invoked over societies racialized as non-white, all else equal. Next, to address variation in R2P invocation among countries in the South, I examine a set of cases qualitatively to show that selective inaction by the international community is racial as it is strategic. This study demonstrates one way racism can hide behind sovereign equality before the laws that condition interactions between states. A theory of race helps us to deepen our understanding of the contradictory values that often cohere to shape international law and intervention. So today, specifically, I'll focus on the theory, which considers variation along the global color line of R2P, as well as the preliminary results of this particular paper, which again feature in a much larger book project on race and international law. And I'm happy to discuss different sections of the book during Q&A. The responsibility to protect is operationalized mainly by UN resolution. The principle has been invoked in more than 90 UN Security Council resolutions concerning crises in various countries. R2P also is invoked over countries by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. In addition to countries, R2P can be invoked in thematic resolutions concerning the prevention of mass atrocity, prevention of armed conflict, and restricting trade of small arms and light weapons. These resolutions contain preventive and coercive measures of collective action to protect populations at risk. The principle itself, which is articulated in paragraphs 138 and 139 of the summit outcome document, outlines 3 pillars of responsibility. Notably, the first pillar establishes an individual state's responsibility to protect against mass atrocity crimes. Pillars 2 and 3 shift this responsibility to the international community when a state is deemed to manifestly fail or have failed or is at risk to fail its responsibility to protect. This process of making sovereignty conditional in principle fits into a much longer and gradual process of contested sovereignty over time. Elements of the non-alignment movement, for example, the legal shift from juridical to empirical sovereignty, which I'll focus on today, what is understood as the African origins of R2P, and claims about R2P as the normative diminution of sovereignty in international law, each highlight the ways R2P and its underlying principle of responsibility can suffer from selective application along particular racialized notions about who has capacity to govern. On the question of R2P as an outcome of racial bias, specifically a racial double standard, I walk through a theory of how race may shape the principle of responsibility in world politics and decisions on R2P specifically. The modern principle of sovereignty contains ideas about international relations that are conditioned by a social norm of equality. States have equal status before the law and recognize the sovereign right in the other. Sovereignty functions as a principle or rules of behavior that readily translate into the law between states. This legalization occurs in part because sovereignty advances a particular set of norms that are already widely held standards or expectations of group behavior. Sovereignty embraces the assumption of equal membership among states in the international community, making the principle stick in spite of empirical inequalities like size or material capability. This interaction is reinforced by dominant states that exchange sovereign recognition as their least costly strategy. Across varying concepts and applications in contemporary world politics, the principle of sovereignty is consistent in its fundamental proposition that states bargain as equal authority claimants. Today, states are recognized as being juridically equal. Each has exclusive jurisdiction to use coercion within its territorial borders. Sovereignty and equality conform to one another under a consensus definition of sovereign equality within the UN Charter, establishing legal independence between states as subjects of international law. It is the case that the principle of sovereignty has always been subject to some set of criteria. What a state must do to possess sovereign status is variable and contingent upon external recognition. Sovereignty is a practical category whose empirical contents are not fixed, but evolve to reflect the active, intersubjective agreement of states. In effect, it is what states say it is. While sovereign equality, norm and principle, translates de jure, its application depends on member state beliefs and interests that can change in response to the environment. Though relatively stable, the working definition of sovereignty itself can change. Whereas juridical sovereignty emphasizes legal recognition and non-interference, criteria concerned with the behavior of the international community, empirical sovereignty pivots toward the internal condition of the state. Empirical sovereignty promotes a state's capacity for governance and control over the society within its borders. This shift not only reflects policymaker convictions about what principle of sovereignty better mitigates threats to international order, it also reveals where or who member states believe threats to that order emanate from. Apart from maintaining global jurisdiction, the UN is generally preoccupied with North-South relations and problems of the newly independent majority, namely the dangerous disputes in the so-called Third World. Sovereignty, once premised upon collective acceptance of equality and exclusive authority of the state, is now qualified with concern over southerly state capacity for this very status. The responsibility to protect is a formal revision of the sovereignty principle. Some member states suggest that R2P transforms sovereignty into responsibility, fundamentally stripping the principle of equal status between states before the law. This transformation is overlaid by a normative shift away from juridical sovereignty toward empirical sovereignty. By elevating the internal condition of the state and its criteria for sovereign status, R2P makes sovereign recognition subject to external assessments of capacity for self-rule. Principle of sovereignty that depends on variable perceptions of fulfilled responsibility can map onto alternative norms that also promote a notion of conditional self-rule. Just as sovereignty contains conceptual elements that overlap with equality, there are other salient social norms that can advance and embolden a selective view of exclusive authority. Whereas states enjoy equal membership despite their internal characteristics under a standard of sovereign equality, R2P affirms sovereign status based on a state's perceived capacity or will to meet certain political commitments. To be sure, R2P attempts to balance sovereignty with the state's responsibility to protect its people. Yet, the contingent nature of sovereign recognition under R2P runs parallel with other social decisions permitting the denial of self-rule. The UN's de facto focus of R2P on Africa and member state claims of a racial double standard make race particularly relevant on this score. I suggest that racism is one such norm or pattern of social behavior that conditions R2P, a principle that by definition limits the right to self-govern because it features similar underlying beliefs about capacity to self-govern. R2P embraces the notion that values like freedom, security, stability, human rights, the rule of law are endogenous to sovereign responsibility and by extension, the global north. Invoking the principles or the principle as a line of defense against threats to these values presumes that such good values are lacking beyond the geographical limits of where sovereignty is historically assumed and recognized. Once sovereignty is transformed into responsibility, the principle becomes more compatible with racialized notions of capacity for self-governance. The relationship between perceptions of capacity and responsibility is longstanding in international relations. Its normative and empirical construction along the global color line permeated international law throughout the age of empires. Race was tethered to assumptions about capacity as rationale for conquest undertaken by European powers. If applied universally to all peoples and polities, then international law would require Europeans to recognize the sovereign equality of those unfamiliar, particularly people located outside of the Western core. A consistent exercise of the law, however, was at odds with imperial preferences for domination and dispossession of indigenous lands and customs. In order to justify this ambition, despite a precept of sovereign equality, Europeans racialized non-Europeans as inferior. They were fantasized into lacking the moral sentiment, social habits, and legal traditions required for self-rule. Racialized capacity was at the heart of the trade interest and other bargains over indigenous lands and resources between colonial rivals. The use of force to acquire and assert legal title over the darker peoples of the world was neither against nor impertinent to international law. Rather, the belief that non-Europeans were less than human was the very justification used for their expropriation under the law. Race relieved the tension between a conception of equality that governed European relations on the one hand and coercive control over non-Europeans on the other. A contradiction between liberal ideals and colonial practice became particularly acute as the dominion of Europe over the rest of the world reached its zenith. Non-European societies fell short of their responsibility to govern themselves, permitting a civilizing mission of responsibility in turn. The legal duality of responsibility, active long before the R2P principle, betrays a racial double standard. Who is perceived to fall short of their responsibility to govern and who gets to exercise a responsibility to intervene are uneven decisions rooted in racialized assumptions about capacity. Prior to the mid-20th century, Western powers imposed one set of rules to govern among themselves and another set to regulate association with the imperial possessions they constructed throughout Africa and Asia. A similar double standard persists throughout decolonization and despite the formal application of European sovereignty to the rest of the world. Contemporary interactions between states can feature underlying assumptions about capacity that again tether race to ideas about self-rule. This is especially the case when sovereignty rights are contested at the margins. Importantly, racialized capacity not only undermines European sovereignty, it also pedestalizes European capacity for self-governance, producing a double standard along the global color line. The responsibility to protect demonstrates this contradiction in application. The UN can select to suspend a state's sovereignty, presumably based on a set of criteria intended to measure a failure to protect. Yet the decision to invoke R2P may also vary by how state capacity is racialized, controlling for country characteristics that should drive international intervention. However, R2P is not always shaped by racism directly. This is especially the case following renewed calls for formal racial equality at the San Francisco Conference in 1945, and later at the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1969. Moreover, the UN rule of one country, one vote makes formal status supposedly equal, even though predominantly white countries have higher incomes per capita, greater power at the international level, larger militaries, so on and so forth. Thus, what is more likely, the invocation of R2P becomes racialized through the transformation of sovereignty into responsibility, a principle that can affirm racist perceptions about capacity. Such beliefs tend to be inexplicit, under strong social norms and laws against discrimination. Thus, I consider the indirect path racism often takes, that is, it hides behind and thus constitutes the very assumptions about state capacity for government. Recall, just as sovereignty is the formal rule between states, R2P is a principle that stipulates a set of rules, or the three pillars of responsibility, to which sovereignty is now conditional and states consent to adhere. This composite feature of the R2P principle is not just a political commitment to mass atrocity prevention. Rather, it also functions to transmute particular norms into international law. On its face, R2P is designed to safeguard human life against the worst forms of violence and deprivation. Yet, application of the three pillars of responsibility can reflect expectations about a state's capacity for self-governance, including beliefs about race. Where racial stratification is established, principles that contain overlapping constructs or conceptual elements can become racialized. In the case of the first pillar, R2P can be invoked disproportionately over majority non-white countries if beliefs that those countries are inferior and thus unsuited for governance are present. Pillars 2 and 3 of the R2P principle, which commit the international community to responsibility, can function or be applied paternalistically over countries already viewed as inferior and in need of corrective action. Since responsibility in this context relies on a notion of capacity for self-governance, it can fit or affirm prevailing beliefs about race. When this interaction between norm and principle occurs, the UN invokes R2P unevenly by race, potentially putting the sovereign status of certain members to question, and often requiring those members to prove or demonstrate eligibility for sovereignty or capacity to protect. UN invocation then reinforces this interior principle of responsibility, framed by racialized assumptions about capacity, making the cyclical nature of these interactions complete. So based on this process of interactions between principles and norms, I make propositions about R2P as an outcome of a racial standard contested by UN member states over time. First, the international community is more likely to associate a failure to protect with countries racialized as Black, and therefore invoke R2P. Conversely, the UN is more likely to spare white majority states from corrective action, even when the commission of atrocity and symptoms of incapacity are similar or equally severe. So the dependent variable that I focus on here is R2P invocation, which measures the collective decision to invoke R2P via UN resolution over a country. I use data provided by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect on R2P invocations and code the UN resolution as a dichotomous indicator. So R2P is coded 0 if the UN does not invoke R2P in a UN resolution in a given year, and 1 if R2P is invoked. For the independent variable, I use the ethnic dimensions data set and the ethnic power relations data set to create a dichotomous indicator which records Black, coded 1, if the largest racial group within a country is of African descent, and 0 for the converse. The data attempt to measure race as a social construction that varies across countries, ethnic groups, and time. I select this data as the measure of race because it approximates, if imperfectly, a more constructivist approach to the construct of race. It captures regional origins that became relevant as social categories in the context of European colonization, globally, and related processes of white dominant classification. I also use this data set to construct a binary indicator of white, coded 1 if a racial majority of a country is of European descent, and 0 for the converse. And then lastly, I can include a continuous measure for European ancestry that measures the level of European ancestry in a country. It is likely that the presence of mass atrocities matter for the decision to invoke R2P. Recall that the UN World Summit outcome document in 2005 unambiguously identifies 4 atrocities over which the country in question becomes eligible for R2P. These include genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and I'm forgetting one, and ethnic cleansing. So 4 total. Thus, I create binary measures for each mass atrocity event. To accomplish this, I used a team of 11 undergraduate research assistants to read annual atrocity reports published by Amnesty International. They coded each atrocity and provided a description of the atrocities that occurred for a given country in a given year. The criteria used to determine if an event constitutes one or multiple mass atrocities is based on the definitions advanced by the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. So each atrocity is coded as a dichotomous indicator, 1 for present and 2 for not occurring, or excuse me, 0 for not occurring. I also include a variable for conflict-related fatalities. So on its face, R2P is likely invoked over countries that have higher levels of deaths related to conflict. The use of armed force by the government of a state or by formally organized groups against civilians is a condition for mass atrocity to precipitate. Also, R2P should be invoked by the international community only in cases that feature high levels of conflict-related violence. Thus, I use the fatality estimates indicator from the Uppsala conflict data program as a measure for the number of civilian deaths. I also include a continuous measure of state capacity, specifically infant mortality, from the Varieties of Democracy dataset to capture state capacity in a way that's less directly related to atrocity and race. I include this measure of state capacity to attempt to absorb, if imperfectly, the level of risk a state may exhibit for mass atrocity events to occur. So there are other important theoretical reasons for matching on state capacity when constructing a model of international intervention. So recall that this study argues that state capacity becomes racialized when R2P is disproportionately invoked over non-white states, all else equal. The stereotype of Black populations in particular as deficient and in need of correction is so embedded in this doctrine of intervention that mere mention of capacity within the R2P principle as a condition of R2P itself activates this underlying trope of incapacity. So without accounting for capacity in the model, it's really difficult to disentangle the impact of racism from the effects of a state's capacity on this decision to invoke R2P. Lastly, I include the ethno-linguistic fractionalization index variable from the HIEF dataset. A robust literature on intra and international conflict suggests that patterns of ethnic diversity will shape outcomes of violence. So my purpose for including it here in the model is to parse out the effect of ethnic diversity from the effect of race, especially if they correlate, although they don't do so perfectly. So I use two strategies to model R2P invocation. The first type estimates propensity scores in order to match covariates for the binary treatment of race. The second type generates balancing weights for the continuous treatment of race. I calculate propensity scores using logistic regression in order to create a multivariate composite of the covariates, the ones that I've just described, that likely influence R2P invocation. So this strategy seeks to balance Black and non-Black or white and non-white in another model, countries' propensity for either treatment. I employ nearest neighbor matching and caliper adjustment to increase the quality, ideally, of the matches between groups. Having matched on these key covariates and evaluated the quality of balance, I estimate the effects of race on R2P. I implement logistic regressions and cluster standard errors on the country to account for a correlation in the error. So each column in the table reports the regression for coefficients and standard errors of R2P invocation. So columns 1 through 6 display the association between the main independent variables. So here I have Black and non-Black, white, non-white, and European ancestry, and the decision to invoke the responsibility to protect respectively and with control. So I first match on those covariates, and then again, I control for them for a more judicious model. As the results suggest, how a country is racialized matters for the decision to invoke R2P, even when accounting for mass atrocities, state and non-state violence towards civilians, state capacity, and ethno-linguistic fractionalization. In column 1, Black is positive and statistically significant at the 0.01 level, indicating a relationship with R2P invocation. When a country is predominantly African and cast as Black within the international community, the UN is more likely to associate the country in question with a failure to protect, and therefore invoke its subsequent collective responsibility to intervene. This finding is consistent with hypothesis 1, and when I control for variables, or when the control variables are lagged, to account for invocations that may occur in response to ongoing and escalating violations. The effects of white and European ancestry also align with the expectations of this study. White and European ancestry are negative and significant at the 0.1 level. So while statistically weak, R2P invocation in this case is less likely when a country is racialized as white. An increase in the level of European ancestry within a country is associated with a decrease in the likelihood of R2P invocation. Though a country that is predominantly European may feature similar types of levels of atrocity, civilian fatality, state capacity, and ethnic diversity to non-European states, the UN will still uphold the decision to invoke corrective action over the country. these results indicate support for hypothesis 2. So without overstating the regression results, because this is still quite early work, I've presented some evidence suggesting the importance of race in the decision to intervene through the responsibility to protect principle. This study demonstrates one way racism can hide behind sovereign equality before the laws that govern interactions between states. My hope is that a theory of race can help us begin to reconcile the patterns of often contradictory values that shape the outcomes we observe in international law and intervention. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, we will start, as is the practice here, with any of the CSEC fellows. Okay, with Harold, I'll even include the CDDRL fellows as well, since there are some here. We'll start with them and encourage folks online to put their questions using the Q&A function. So, questions from any? Yeah, go ahead.
Do you know what is relation decision and whether how this country is in other alliances, whether economic or military ones? Have a lot of have you thought about it in any way? Intervened with all sorts of alliances. Sure, this action, so
Sure, thank you. So I don't match on alliances when kind of considering the covariates that might most likely drive intervention. That could be one that I certainly add. Because there's not, the observations aren't that large, especially after the RAs finish coding, there may be between 600 and 700 observations to match on countries. It eats up a lot of that variation. And so I tried to prioritize the covariates or the indicators that likely drive intervention. But that is one I can think a lot more about in terms of our kind of external or other alliances, not the UN driving kind of the decision to intervene in certain countries versus others. Thank you.
Go ahead, and then Chung, we'll go first to her, and then yeah, go ahead, and then we'll go to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alana Resnick.
Hey, Alana, hi. Sorry.
Hi, I'm an anthropologist at UC Santa Barbara. My question is about thinking of intersectionality, personal basis, but how that might extend to the geopolitics. So how does actions of religion with Black countries impact your findings?
Thank you. So in reading UN resolutions, I specifically for the invocation of R2P, or more broadly, just discussion kind of at the resolution level about these mass atrocity events. I don't recall religion being discussed as the focus or the motivation for invoking or not invoking R2P. What is clear to me is that that point of intersectionality, I think, is a really relevant one. So when we read UN resolutions, it's very clear that the groups that are being discussed, whether they're armed groups or civilians that are grouped in particular ways, that religion or ethnicity or tribal affiliation does come up quite a bit. So it might be similar to race, and where it's not, it might not, religion itself might not be as explicit, but could still be driving some of the perception of how these countries are perceived, especially on the question of capacity and can certain groups or certain countries, if we aggregate up, are they eligible for sovereignty when mass atrocity could be present? So thank you.
Hi, my name is Changguk Ju. I'm a CSAC fellow here at Stanford. I have two questions. So firstly, theoretically, what are your alternative hypotheses or alternative explanations to your argument? So you address some of them in the control variables, but I could think of a lot of potential counter arguments, including alliance relationships, economic developments, mostly at the state level, and also capacity, military capacity differentials between rebel and state forces, et cetera, et cetera. So I was wondering about some of the alternative explanations that you came up with in the process of your research. And secondly, could you go back to the your data section?
Sure. This,
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask you about the distribution of your outcome. So you have like 165 R2P invocations in 21 countries, and how many countries are the black majority country and white majority countries respectively, and how many invocations were invoked in each of those countries?
great. I'll take the second question first. So in the data set, a majority of the kind of civilian deaths, settings where mass atrocity is prevalent, and so there are much greater counts of civilian casualties. From my recollection, there are, I believe, 2 or 3 white countries, and so it's very skewed towards non-European. I think those include Ukraine, Russia, and then maybe one other Eastern European country, and that's it. And so, and that's just the question of how countries are racialized as white versus not white. So those are, Eastern European examples, but some UN member states and even scholars on the question consider Israel racialized in a certain way. Israel comes up in the data set, but every other country is non-European. So really a vast majority of the observations. And to the second part of your second question, so there are several instances where, let me go back to the slide, R2P is invoked multiple times over the same country in a given year. And so that's one way I could change the DV is by measuring counts, which I do have a column for that, but that's not in this analysis, as well as kind of, I'm sure there's differences in intensity of R2P. And so maybe the first pillar is activated much more frequently, of course, than actually carrying out R2P in an economic way or in a kind of use of force way. And so that's another way to measure the dependent variable. To your first question, so yes, because of the number of observations, I really did try to privilege things that the literature and that just kind of intuition would suggest we're going to drive the decision to intervene. And so mass atrocities were at the top of that list. Also, just the number of casualties, we're likely never going to observe R2P coming up in a UN resolution where there aren't a very large number of civilian casualties. And then other things to try to disentangle or absorb things that race could capture. And that is capacity, ethno-linguistic fractionalization. But those aside, kind of economic development indicators, it's a point well taken, matching on, or even just controlling for those, even if I don't match on them, especially because in these UN resolutions, there are member states suggesting that, well, we feel that there's a double standard, but is it between developing and developed countries? Is it between, the North and the South and whatever, kind of all the things that are captured by those terms. also military capacity, as you suggested. I think at a minimum, I could control for those. Thank you.
So we'll open it up more broadly. I'm going to use my prerogative as a moderator here to ask a question. And I actually want to ask a question about two cases that precede the formal responsibility to protect, and but both of which fed into the deliberations and the decision to adopt the responsibility to protect, and would seem to cut against your argument. So I was just curious whether you've thought about them in the context of the argument you make post 2005. One was the failure to intervene to stop the genocide in Rwanda. And the second was the decision to, which was not made by the United Nations, but was made by NATO, to attack Serbia in order to protect the population of Kosovo. And there were a lot of discussions of the issues you're raising in the Kosovo operation. On the one hand, those who supported it were expressing pride in themselves that they were supporting this Muslim population in Kosovo. And those who thought it shouldn't happen were arguing, wait, why are you attacking this white Christian population in order to protect a Muslim population? So I was just curious whether sort of the discussions around those two cases feed into the work that you're interested in.
Right. Thank you. So this question is fascinating for me because kind of the unspoken tension in this project is kind of which mechanism is it? Is it that countries are racialized as inferior and so we need to intervene because they've just failed responsibility? Or is it that countries are racialized and there's this sentiment that they just don't matter, so we're going to ignore their persecution? And the goal here, and I didn't bring up cases in this aspect of the project, but the goal, I can make an argument that maybe we're observing both, and there's a theory that could speak to both that still has kind of a synergy. And so in the cases of Rwanda and Kosovo, there were discussions that these populations pre-R2P were racialized in such a way where they just, especially Rwanda, they just did not matter. And maybe the behaviors that were being observed were expected in that kind of population. There are arguments for that. In the next stage of this project, when I look at the qualitative cases, for example, like Ethiopia, and why intervention has been kind of absent or lacking in that case, or take Libya, where we did observe intervention. I suggest that populations are racialized in whatever way will allow more influential countries to advance their political interests. And we observe this in Libya. We may be observing this, so in a case like Ethiopia, there may be other powerful countries like China or Russia that would not want to support separatist movements in Ethiopia, for example. And that's just one case. Myanmar is another instance where intervention has been very slow because of its proximity to China. Maybe certain member states are not interested in the world intervening in those contexts. And so I think there's a variety of reasons that are pure politics as to why we might not observe intervention when we think we should, especially for the indicators that I match on and control for. However, what I think, at least anecdotally, it appears that race is still a part of the conversation. And again, it basically functions how states want it to justify certain.
Interesting. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tom. And then we'll go to Ken. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Tom Finger, I'm a fellow in the Asia Pacific Research Center. Thank you for an excellent explication of R2P. Extremely well done. Observations about One was a discussion, court debate.
Yes.
Trumping state.
Right.
Basically,
Mhm.
a whole lot more cases majority of members of the United Nations that goes what one might anticipate. The other is that did you look at the decision process in individual countries?
Hmm.
In order to get at the country position, they had a wrestle. And the kind of things that had to deal with here. One,
Mhm.
what's the evidence that you produced to make the case that genocide had occurred in Rwanda? And the expectations or demands for the quality of evidence and methodology were linked to US law.
Mhm.
And obligations as a member of a permanent member of the Security Council. Some of these outcomes, if we decided it was genocide, we're obligated to pay for it. Commission. Another aspect of it was alluded to with the question. Countries don't face these issues independently of all of the other things they're trying to do. And did you anything about either efforts of call them big powers,
Mhm.
powers with their own broad agendas, influence these decisions, where these decisions were basically treated as sort of below the threshold for involvement? I could ask more, but you've done such a terrific job. I can't help but push it.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. I need it. Thank you. You bring up so many interesting points and things that I will think more deeply about, especially the point on a majority of member states are non-white. And so we might expect or anticipate whenever R2P is invoked, it's done so over more white countries. So what immediately comes to mind is the Security Council. And so most UN resolutions on R2P are from the Security Council. And so, even though we might expect more more instances of R2P, or even just acknowledging mass atrocities or the potential for them going on in countries that are racialized as white, we don't see them most likely because they might not be advanced to the stage of UN resolution to where countries will agree, or those the P5 will agree to kind of invocation of R2P, or even suggesting that a white country is in violation of certain standards. To the question on individual cases, R2P, as far as data is concerned, UN resolution, please correct me if I'm wrong, at least in my study, is most readily observed at the resolution level. And so there are like Office of the Rapporteur and other kind of sub organs that discuss R2P, but not so systematically across countries and years that I've been able to find. And so I think that is another point why qualitative study is so important in this context, to understand what's going on the ground, how these atrocities are discussed. A country at the country level may have to acknowledge, okay, this crisis rises to the level. There may be incentives not to do that, especially in the case of powerful countries or white countries. And so I agree that the diving into individual cases will be very important. And lastly, yes, this is a point well taken that these decisions and even what is included or kind of makes it to the end of like publishing a UN resolution, these are not done in a vacuum. And so there are a lot of competing kind of geopolitical interests and incentives going on. And reading UN resolutions that invoke R2P, sometimes there's mention or certain countries that are involved in the resolution will cite crises in neighboring countries, issues of spillover. But I don't get a strong sense that other issues that could or could not be related are discussed in tandem with this discussion of R2P in a particular meeting that ends up becoming a UN resolution. And so these resolutions, they're not very long typically, and they are about a crisis, say in South Sudan, and everything regarding that on the ground, whether again it's violence perpetuated by the state or by armed groups. And so I think that is something I would look much more into. How can these kind of related tensions or geopolitical interests be shaping these discussions, even if it's not legible in a UN resolution, but just kind of investigating other sources.
And before I go to Ken, so I just wanted to clarify a part of Tom's question because I heard it, I think, a little differently, but I'm just curious whether which one of us heard it correctly, or I think it could be both. In terms of the decision-making process, you were referring to the decision-making process within the United Nations. I took your question to mean the decision-making process in a country like the United States, or mean whether or not to bring this to the UN. And it would seem to be both. Now, that would seem to be a lot of work to do, but I was just curious whether that was the question. Yeah.
Problem here.
Yeah.
That
Yes.
to a vote in the United States, somebody brings it to the table.
Oh.
Right. That's what yeah. So it's both of these things. Yeah.
Who's going to pay for it?
Mm-hmm.
Triggers in American law. Pay for the troops to go in.
Right.
And other countries clearly have less complex, but not.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. And that's something I can look into by the time it reaches the UN resolution, or even kind of plenary meetings, say Security Council. It'll state the diplomat or the representative from said country. But you're right, it's very clear that their stance on the issue is already formulated. And so there's a process that precedes that could provide more insight. But it could very well be a really interesting two-level issue to get to the outcome of R2P. Thank you.
Melissa has a two-finger, and then we'll go to Ken and Harold. And I'm still waiting if somebody online wants to put something in the Q&A.
Thank you. Very interesting work. Just jumping in on the question, have you thought about flipping it? So for example, if you looked at who had abstained or who had vetoed out of the P5 and looking at that in terms of the racial equity, about who might make that decision. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Then we'll go to Ken. Yeah.
Excellent.
You want to comment on that at all?
I have not, but I will. Thank you.
Ken Schultz, political science and CSAC. So thanks for this. I was interested that you framed the talk really in terms of sovereignty and the idea that racial attitudes might affect our beliefs about which states. That argument makes a lot of sense. But I'd also ask the question: whose lives are worth saving from state violence. And here I was just wondering if you'd kind of just react to Finnemore's work. She argues that like the good news here, we used to not care when Black people were killed. We only intervened when white people were being killed. And so couldn't you look at this and say, hey, well, this is in her view, like an expansion of who is fully human and is worthy of intervention?
Oh, yes. Thank you. If I may quickly, yeah, so at least on like a normative level, absolutely. R2P is ideally about saving more lives and preventing another Rwanda. I think in terms of a racial double standard, and there are a number of ways to frame this, but in terms of a racial double standard, and when I've been confronted with this question before, it might shed light not so much on when R2P is invoked, ideally, or mass atrocities are stopped maybe more frequently in countries where they're occurring or have the potential to occur. And a lot of times this tends to be in the global South. It's that atrocities in the North maybe aren't. And so that's perhaps the double standard that I think stands out the most to me, is not so much where intervention or R2P, the principle of sovereignty as responsibility, is invoked over atrocities that maybe could happen or are happening. It's that maybe where they are happening or have the potential to, they might it might not be invoked maybe when it should. And so it's that double standard. And so it might not be so much of a commentary about not preventing or intervening, but again, maybe the UN is deciding not to, or to kind of abstain in situations or crises where maybe there is a reason to, and this tends to fall nicely along the global color line. And we don't observe these, at least in the data set. Again, there's not that many countries that are racialized as white where we're observing these kind of super high counts of civilian casualties. But in the cases that we are, again, the UN is likely not going to intervene in the same way or intensity. So, thank you.
Go to Harold and then Norman.
Right. Mm. Mhm. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. So quickly, yes, so some of my other projects, they do attempt to tackle this very question of kind of sovereignty applied differently, and race is the driving explanation. And so in another kind of part of the book project, I look specifically at kind of basing interactions between states, specifically US basing and defense kind of arrangements or agreements. And I make a very similar argument. And so jurisdiction over US troops overseas, for example, tends to be withheld from non-white host countries and granted or shared with predominantly European or white host countries, all else equal. And so I keep encountering this kind of theory or idea, this basic idea that the notion of self-rule, who can govern themselves, and bless you, and then again, who has the right in this case to govern or regulate the behavior of US forces on host soil, so it's extraterritorial jurisdiction, varies by race. And so that's one area that I consider. Another area is peacekeeping, so kind of another flavor of international intervention. But I agree. I think that looking into more kind of regional interactions and some of the other examples that you stated, states may kind of feature in this regional hierarchy or even international hierarchy, and that shapes certainly kind of their repertoire for behavior and action. Some of it may be racial, some of it might not be. And then race means different things in different parts of the world, certainly. And so my work primarily looks at the global color line, but I don't dispute that there's very important variation at the regional or even the domestic level that could even be driving some of these more international outcomes.
Okay, did you write the dissertation as a book or as a set of papers? Right?
As a book.
You did write it as a book.
Yes,
Okay,
as a
so these are so all this was part of the is now you're revising for the book. Okay,
Oh, yes.
so it had these
Lots of
different parts.
revising.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay, that's
And so
great.
it's
But you've
constructed.
pulled some out for articles.
Yes,
Right?
correct.
Like yeah.
Yeah, pulled some out for articles, and the annual review piece is kind of the early prototype, especially the parts on race and capacity in international law, and how it shapes these, specifically these outcomes in the law.
Norman. Yep, please.
Talk. And I'm an historian. My name is Norman Neymark, and I'm a fellow here at CSAC. So two questions, and you started to talk about actually one of my questions towards the end of your answer to Harold's question, and that has to do with this whole question of racialization and race and what it actually means exactly in your project, because I keep going back and forth. Sometimes when you talk about racialization, I think, well, it's the creation of another, a race, out of a people that is not a black-white situation at all. Or Rwanda was mentioned, which is a black-black situation, a kind of racialization, of the victim. So how do you think about that a little bit? I mean, after all, the Russians racialize the Ukrainians, the Israelis racialize Gaza and Palestinians. Are they really different? Are they not different races? And when you talk about race, you maybe be a little bit more explicit, in how you're thinking about that in this project. And the second question really has to do in part with two things. One is one of the results of your project, which is to show that the invocation of R2P less and less over time recently.
Yes.
And the other is just an impressionistic thing on my part, which is that in reading, as I try to do as much as I can about Gaza and about conflict and about, what's going on in the world, you barely hear anything in the newspaper. New York Times is not talking about R2P. Now, that doesn't mean it's not important, but I wonder, first of all, whether you see some sort of downward interest or well, I guess that's the right word, downward interest in R2P and whether it's useful at all anymore. There were times when things like the Genocide Convention weren't used or other things weren't used and then were after a while. Or whether you think the critique that you articulated at the very beginning of R2P is actually having an effect where people are absorbing essentially your point of view that this is a kind of racialized doctrine that is not very useful.
Thank you. So briefly to your first point, it's well taken. So I don't go into so much exactly what I mean by racialization. I kind of just gloss over it. And a lot of it hinges on the theory of, I'm suggesting that it's the pillars themselves of responsibility and the principle of R2P that are doing the work of kind of transmuting norms of racial bias or racism into the principle and eventually the outcome. But that's a point well taken. I think history is like replete with examples of race doing the work that states want it to. And so we have instances of one European country racializing another kind of co-European equal as racially inferior. And this is like we see this, in the pre-war, post-war period, and since. And so at the country level, so you talk about the case of Rwanda, that was a population, ethnic divide that were racialized differently. And so again, this does look differently depending on the context. And so with my analysis, a lot of that is kind of, we lose some of that really rich nuance when I'm just focusing on the country level, what's going on the ground. And so, yeah, the qualitative casework is going to be incredibly important, but I can be more explicit about racialization in this context, which again, is going to really be driven by the theory that I'm working with. And to the second point, yes, there's a lot of discussion and just kind of R2P leaves a very bad taste in many mouths, especially after Libya in 2011, for good reason. And so there could be a number of reasons why it's being invoked less, or it's just, and what I mean by that is we just see it mentioned less in UN resolutions over time, especially 2017, I believe, onward. I would argue that it's not that countries with mass atrocities or the risk is not being talked about. I think the term invocation of this specific principle may be happening less, and it would be good to know why that is the case.
I mean, the courts more, right? I mean, the courts seem much more present and much more active than R2P.
Yes. Yes. And so there is a recent paper, I believe in ISQ, that does a really excellent job of kind of combing through these UN resolutions and seeing what terms pop up the most. And from what I recall, what the authors found is that there are other terms that are synonyms for responsibility that are being used more than responsibility to protect. And so I would be personally surprised if the principle itself is just gone or never invoked by countries. It may just be they're using other words for it because R2P has such a bad reputation now.
It's also, I mean, it is worth noting just with respect to the book project that the R2P is just the first part. You do also have the status agreements, as you had mentioned, and then a peacekeeping. So whatever happens with R2P, the book project is saved.
Right.
It's okay.
Part of the reason why at least the way I'm thinking about this is it's kind of different outcomes we tend to associate with international intervention, and just this idea that sovereignty can be contested or applied differently, explanatory variable, depending on how a state is racialized.
And that is a great place to end what's been a great conversation. Thanks so much for taking the time to come.